Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather outlook for Friday, August 2nd, 2024. Today, we're going over a potential tropical cyclone that could hit Florida this weekend. It's looking very likely now. What is now a potential tropical cyclone 4? It was Invest 97L earlier. It is now a potential tropical cyclone, meaning it is not a tropical system yet, but it is very likely to become one, and it is going to impact land very soon. So, tropical storm watches and warnings have been issued for the west coast of Florida. There's a lot to unpack today with this storm, and there's also other stuff going on in the eastern Pacific as well. With now Hurricane Carlota. So we'll go over all of that today. Let's start off though in the Atlantic with PTC4. Once again, it is a potential system, meaning that it likely will develop, even though it is not developed yet, but it's very close. And because of that, it is close enough that they already deem it necessary to be able to issue watches and warnings, which are in effect for Florida. Those that in which we will go over in a moment. But first, its current intensity right now, maximum sustained winds at 30 miles per hour, minimum central pressure of 1,012 millibars. So we still have yet for the center of circulation of this system to become defined enough to become a tropical system. It's still pretty weak right now, but it is developing. If you're tracking it on a map, it's located at 20.9 north and 76.6 west, and its movement is west-northwest at 16 miles per hour. And let's really quickly take a look at the watches and warnings issued. There is a tropical storm warning right now in effect for the southwest coast of the Florida Peninsula from East Cape Sable to Bonita Beach. Tropical storm watch is also in effect for the Florida Keys south of the Card Sound Bridge, including the Dry Tortugas, the southern coast of Florida Peninsula of East Cape Sable to the Card Sound Bridge, and the west coast of Florida Peninsula north of Bonita Beach to Aripeca, I think. But bottom line, we have watches and warnings issued all up along the western coast of Florida, meaning that conditions are very likely to occur within the next 36 to 48 hours. Hence why this is not yet a tropical system, but it will impact land very soon. So because of that, they want to issue these watches and warnings as soon as possible. Before we actually go into the satellite, though, I really quickly want to go over the Eastern Pacific because there is some activity going on there. We have now Hurricane Carlota, which is a Category 1 right now, 80 miles per hour with a minimum central pressure of 983 millibars. It's likely going to strengthen a little bit more as it moves out to the west-northwest, away from any land. It's probably going to become a Category 2 hurricane within the next few hours before it then weakens and eventually becomes a post-tropical system by the day 5 period on the National Hurricane Center. Once again, staying away from any main land areas and away from the Mexican coastline. So that is good. There's also another area, though, that is behind it. This will also likely become a tropical system over the next several days, and this too will stay off the western coast of Mexico. So nothing to worry about in terms of Pacific threats, even though we do have quite a bit of activity going on there right now. But obviously, we have our own baggage here in the Atlantic to deal with. This is PTC4L. Right now over Cuba, it is still, once again, hence why it's not a tropical system. It's not given the name Debbie yet, which is the next name on the list, because it is not quite a tropical cyclone yet. It is still in the development stages, and you could clearly see that on the satellite. This does have a pretty defined circulation, but it's not necessarily consolidated just quite yet enough to be considered a tropical system. But I think the biggest thing that I think we should point out right now is pretty widespread areas of showers and thunderstorms. There's kind of this northern area right here, which is right along the northern coast of Cuba. And then we also have lots of thunderstorms in the southern part of Cuba, which is bringing showers and thunderstorms to Jamaica. And also probably throughout the rest of Cuba as well, and even the southern Bahamas is getting in on the shower and thunderstorm activity, which that in itself will already mean an inconvenience probably to somebody. So it's important to mention this is bringing impacts to the northern islands, and eventually these impacts will make their way into Florida. And I think it is important to mention that there's lots of widespread showers and thunderstorm activity, and that's going to play a huge part into heightening the risk for widespread flooding once that becomes an issue, when this sort of system, this mess of a system, makes its way to Florida. We're looking at probably one of the biggest issues with this, regardless of intensity, is going to be flash flooding and heavy rain over a widespread portion of Florida and the southeast. But it's not quite developed a system yet. But obviously it's going to, and it's obviously already very close to Florida, and it's going to get closer within the next few days, which is why they issued watches and warnings right now. Really quickly though, just before we get the visuals on that, here's the 850 millibar vorticity, and you can see that there is a defined circulation over Cuba right now, though, although leaning towards the southern part of Cuba. And until this moves over any sort of real estate of water, this is still going to be defined and broad. It's not going to have much time to really consolidate yet until this moves over water, which is why the National Hurricane Center is issuing advisories now on it as a potential tropical cyclone rather than a tropical system. But it is going to bring impacts to Cuba. There are no watches and warnings in effect for there right now, but it'll still bring heavy rain and gusty winds regardless to Cuba. But the main vorticity energy is over Cuba right now, and therefore, at least for the next 12 to 24 hours, at least for the next day or so, we're not going to see that much consolidation from this system just quite yet. But if you look at the National Hurricane Center, they expect this to move off of Cuba into the Gulf, into actual open water by tomorrow. They expect this to happen by late tomorrow morning, and then by Sunday evening they have this making landfall or nearing the coast of Florida, already nearing the coast of Florida actually by Sunday, and then it seems like Sunday evening this actually moves inland over Florida, and then crosses the Florida coast and then ends up somewhere along the southeast into early next week. And this will actually be something we need to watch potentially for the Carolinas in terms of impact heading into early next week as well. We're just focusing on Florida right now because that's where we're going to see the first line of impacts, and obviously that's where you can see where all the tropical storm watches and warnings have been issued for right now. I will say though, this will intensify pretty quickly. This will get its act together pretty quickly over the Gulf. Probably it's not going to have enough time that it's going to become a hurricane before it makes landfall in Florida over the Gulf, but that really could change, especially if the model guidance shifts any more to the west, and this has more time over water. But you can see most of them right now, in conjunction with the National Hurricane Center cone, taking this towards a western Florida landfall. There's a few of these models that still show it a little bit more towards the west and into the panhandle. And this will be the thing that we need to watch for over the next several hours, is how much do we see PTC4 shift in terms of its center. If we see a center that tries to consolidate more towards the southern part of Cuba, and we try to see this trying to form a little bit earlier, but it ends up coming into the Gulf a little bit more towards the west, will that track make this shift a little bit more towards the west, that more of the Gulf coast, especially the panhandle of Florida, is at play? Or do we see what the model guidance does right now, and this kind of stays along the northern part of Cuba, and then we see a landfall that's more along the western peninsula of Florida? There's a lot to go over, and this will certainly impact not only who's going to get what in terms of land impacts, but also the intensity as well. As I mentioned, lots of the model guidance is taking this into western Florida, and obviously that's going to mean much less time over water. So because of that, you can see with the potential model guidance, not a lot of them are really making this strong, any stronger than a tropical storm really. Most of them, if not almost all of the model guidance, is keeping this near tropical storm intensity. The SHIP model doing a little bit something weird. They take this all the way to Cat 2, but This is more, I think, statistical probabilities in terms of intensification rather than actual dynamical model, which is the ship model. Most of the other models, though, most of the other dynamical models right now keep this as a tropical storm into the Gulf once again because of how little time this will probably have. But thank God that this will have not that much time over the Gulf, at least with the current solutions we see right now, because here's the sea surface temperatures, and I think, and if you watched my live stream last night, I mentioned this as well, but this will really be a key factor into not only, obviously, if this spends more time over the Gulf, if we see any more shifts west, that this spends maybe a few extra hours over the Gulf, maybe we could see more intensification of the system before it hits Florida. But just look at how warm these sea surface temperatures are. And you got to remember that that's also going to add an extra layer of moisture as well with this storm. The only issue really with PTC4 is just the fact that it's going to be coming off of Cuba, and it's probably, at least by the current model guidance, going to crash into Western Florida within 24 hours of it, emerging off of Cuba. But even then, look at the sea surface temperatures near the western coast of Florida. It's going to be very, very warm and more than enough for quite quick intensification of the system. Even if it's only going to have 24 hours, it's probably going to try to get its act together quickly. And we'll probably see a pretty decent tropical storm regardless head into Florida. Maybe it will not be like if it becomes a hurricane, because it'll probably take a more western track, and I believe if this were to take a more western track, that'll probably be a lot more of a better case scenario for it in terms of becoming a stronger system, because it'll have just all this much more warm water to deal with in the Eastern Gulf. But it's going to be a very interesting scenario for sure to watch. There's definitely lots of energy in the Gulf no matter what. It really doesn't seem like anything is going to be much of a factor that's going to impede it except the time it's going to have over the Gulf. And I guess you could really see that illustrated by the GFS, especially with how quickly it moves off of Cuba. This is the 12Z run of the GFS so far. You see 24 hours out, the GFS has PTC4 barely exiting Cuba, and then watch how quickly it moves from exiting off of Cuba to then making a landfall in southwestern Florida. It only has a day over water, and even still then, the GFS tries to ramp this up pretty quickly. Let me actually see what the pressure on this system is, if I can find the MSLP. You know what, I guess I'm just going to have to do with the moisture and precipitation. They have this, a decent tropical system, 1,002 millibars over Florida, which, by the way, with this current track, is going to mean a lot more rain over the actual Florida peninsula, and that'll probably be a lot more of a threat for a lot more people in terms of rain. But obviously, because of that, doesn't have a lot of time to intensify over the Gulf into anything too strong. But even then, you can still see it tries to get its act together pretty quickly, and then as a result of that, the GFS makes this cross into Florida. And then over the next several days, as we head towards the day 5 time frame, this kind of becomes something that we need to watch very closely over the southeast, which over the southeast as well, along the Gulf Stream, the waters too are very warm. So once we get past this Florida threat, this might be something we need to watch for the southeast as well. But that's the GFS solution, and this is kind of very interesting to highlight in terms of the different scenarios that this storm will take, because the GFS brings this into the western coast of Florida. The European, on the other hand, has this taking the longer route, and this moves off of Cuba within 24 to 30 hours, but it ends up in Florida within 72 hours. It makes landfall in Florida over 72 hours, rather than by Sunday evening or Sunday afternoon. This is already nearing the coast of Florida within the next 48 hours. The European kind of takes a longer track, and it brings us over the very, very warm waters of the Northern Gulf, and it keeps the storm weak. And I think this is something that we all know by now, not to really pay attention too closely to the global models when it comes to intensity. So, which is why I'm not really too sure about the European keeping this kind of a weak signature as it moves into Florida. But that's a pretty big difference if you kind of think about it, especially given how warm the Gulf is. The GFS has a solution where we have a landfall south of Tampa along the southwest coast of Florida, while in the European, it's all the way near the Panhandle in the Big Bend, and that seems like almost basically an extra day basically over water. And we saw how warm those sea surface temperatures are in the Gulf, widespread 30s, 31 Celsius. That is easily upper 80s, lower 90s in terms of sea surface temperatures in Fahrenheit, and that is bathtub water. That is lots of energy for the storm to take. So these are really going to be trends that we need to watch over the next several days, and it's really going to mean a lot, especially in terms of intensity, that also will change things in terms of impacts that we see for Florida as well. But I think regardless, whatever happens in terms of impacts, the one thing that I think will remain the same is the rainfall. Obviously, depending on the track shifts that we get, certain people will probably get, things will kind of shift around in terms of who gets what in terms of rain, but somebody is going to get a lot of rainfall. And I think this is very well laid out by the National Hurricane Center. This is actually by the Weather Prediction Center, with the greatest flash flood risk over the next 5 days. Notice, not just in Florida, but all throughout the Southeast, we have a slight risk of flash flooding. So it's going to be a widespread rain threat. Lots of people are going to see flooding, and we got to remember, these tropical systems, they produce lots of rain regardless, especially if they're weak. They really have a lot. The biggest threat really relies on the rainfall, and sometimes that people are caught off guard by the rainfall, and sometimes as well, our biggest tropical cyclones in history are because of the flooding and the rainfall that they produce. Just go back to Harvey. Made landfall in Texas as a Category 4, but for most of the time that it was over Texas, it was a weak system, obviously because it was over land, but it still produced copious amounts of rainfall for portions widespread throughout Texas, and obviously that caused as much damage as it did, and Harvey went down as probably one of the most memorable tropical cyclones in history. So we got to really remember the rainfall threat from this storm is going to be huge, and it'll be widespread all across the Southeast, especially something to watch for the Carolinas as well. Once whatever happens with PTC4 emerges over the Southeast, if it does. And also in terms of Florida impacts in the near term, got to remember storm surge too. This is not going to be a very strong system, so we're not going to see incredible amounts of storm surge, but 1 to 3 feet along some coastal areas. That'll also add to the coastal flooding risk. There's definitely multiple impacts to keep in mind with PTC4, and it's going to be a developing situation that we're going to watch over the next several hours. I think the biggest thing we need to see is what track shifts we get, which will probably alter, I think, the intensity especially, and it'll also alter as well who gets what in terms of rainfall. But regardless, this is a threat to Florida. Everybody in Florida should be on watch. I think there's a state of emergency issued. So especially if you're in the watches and warnings areas, even if you're in the northwestern part of Florida, I watch this system very closely and monitor the progress through it, as once again, it will be a system that'll hit Florida, and it'll probably develop this weekend as well. And it doesn't have a name now, but the watches and warnings are in effect already. So that should definitely give you some sort of ground to begin to prepare on. And it'll probably also get a name eventually within the next day or so as well, once again, as this gets into the Gulf. So a lot to monitor for the next several days, and we'll definitely keep an eye on it right here. With that being said, though, I'm going to end it off for now. If you're new to the channel and if you really found this video informative, I would appreciate it if you like, comment, subscribe. If you have any questions about what your location will see, especially if you're watching from Florida, um, definitely put them in the comments, and I'll try to answer them as soon as possible and give as much information as I can as well to you. Stay safe. If you're in Florida, watch the tropics, even if you're in the southeast along the Carolinas too. Once again, we're talking about a widespread area looking at threat for potential impacts, especially from the rainfall. So everywhere along the southeast, you guys should be watching this system very closely. And we'll see what happens over the next several days. Stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we will certainly talk again very soon.